Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to the East West Center in Washington on this beautiful sunny Wednesday afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the East West Center in Washington Professor Saori Katada. Saori Katada is a professor at the School of International Relations and the director of the Center for International Studies at the University of Southern California. Professor Katada is the editor, co-editor, author of numerous articles and books on trade, financial, and monetary cooperation in East Asia, as well as Japanese foreign aid. And Professor Katada is a friend of East West Center in Washington. Professor Katada was an Asia Studies visiting fellow here in 2015. So again, it's a pleasure to welcome you back. And with that, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you. I don't know if we are starting a bit early, I guess, but thank you everybody for coming in this very humid weather. So I'm from Los Angeles, so it takes me a while to get used to this weather, but I guess summer is coming, so it's a good thing to have this nice weather. So I think my sense for today, since we don't have to discuss it, would be to have more dialogue after my presentation. I'm working on this for a long haul, so I would like to get your inputs about where I'm heading and kind of information and insights you would have on the topics. I would like to kind of keep that. I would like you to keep that in mind. So first of all, I would like to thank the East West Center in Washington. As Ross was already mentioning, I was here for 3 months in the fall of 2015. That was an exciting time actually to be here in Washington, D.C. If you remember the history, that was a time, October of 2015 was the time that TPP was actually agreed in Atlanta, and I got here about that time. And also there was a lot of discussion in relation to the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So I will touch on that a little bit, but it was really nice to be back. I also thank Satu, obviously, and Sarah to arrange this visit today. So what I would like to do today is I have two parts to discuss. One part is basically talking about the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the Japan's response or Japan's initiative, which is usually called QPI. PQI, Partnership for Quality Investment. And both are probably quite well-known subject for all of you guys in the sense of this is the hot topic of the day. And I would like to kind of go over it with the emphasis of what either they are competing, is it geostrategic, whatnot, and looking at some of the cases that happens within the context of PQI and as well as the BRI. So then the second part, what I would like to talk about is actually in addition to kind of this geostrategic dynamics that's taking place in the context of Japan and China competition in the infrastructure investment, there is actually a dynamic which I call a policy diffusion. In the sense that actually there is a very significant level of DNA in relation to infrastructure investment, both in Japan and China. And going back in a longer history of the 70s into 1990s, that there are a lot of policy diffusion coming from Japan to China. And now going forward, there is a lot of interaction. Obviously that kind of seen as a competition, but actually this serves as another round of policy diffusion when it comes to the modality of infrastructure investment. So I would like to kind of supplement our kind of common understanding of competition, geoeconomics, geostrategic dimension of BRI versus PQI, and then go into talk about, well, whether or not that policy diffusion kind of gives more flavor and kind of hopefully a bit more multi-dimensional understanding of this infrastructure investment overall. So first of all, obviously, Belt and Road Initiative, probably one of the hot topics of this session of this Indo-Pacific was the Indo-Pacific Political Economy and Trade Seminar. And I'm sure you have heard a lot of stories about this analysis and so on from the expert. And since I cannot claim to be the expert on this, I'll just give you the kind of synopsis of what's going on. Obviously, this initiative bears various names, One Belt, One Road, and then so on and so forth. Started out in October of 2013 when Xi Jinping announced this in Kazakhstan, and then after that Indonesia, in the context of Silk Road, Economic Belt, and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. That's the mouthful long name started out, kind of gradually shifted into relatively short BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. In that context, and parallel to that, and I will qualify a little bit later, is the announcement of the initiation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. This kind of came to be a very hot topic later on. I will get to in a minute. Along with it, the BRICS, which is obviously where China is a member, with Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, announced its new development bank. At this point, they call it new development bank, but I'd rather see it as a BRICS bank because that distinguishes it in its nature. Later on, in 2017, they had the Belt and Road Forum, the first time in Beijing, with 29 heads of state attending and 130 countries presented, where Japan sent one of its political heavyweight, even though Prime Minister Abe didn't participate. Obviously, as you probably recall, very recently, April of 2019, there was the second round of the forum, of the AIIB forum. So let me just talk a little bit about detail of both of those items of the AIIB as well as the BRI. So when China initiated this initiative for the BRI and AIIB, this was a significant shock. Obviously, many of the announcement and promotion and so on are still promotion, not really taking shape yet, but it's noted to be a $1 trillion investment in infrastructure, both in Southeast Asia, India, going forward towards Africa, as well as Central Asia going into Europe. So these are all the initiatives related to infrastructure development throughout the region around China, going westward, again, through the road, through the belt, which is a land-based initiative, and through the road, which are the sea lane-based initiative going towards Europe and Africa. Obviously, this was, most of it will be funded by China's own banks and funds, like the China Development Bank, as well as China Export-Import Bank, and so on. But also, it created another multilateral institution called the AIIB. This was a $100 billion initiative. And the shocking thing, coming back to March of 2015, was that the United States, Japan, looking at some of the membership kind of starting when the AIIB was starting out, so they could kind of stay away from it. And there are rumors that U.S. kind of convinced some of their allies, like South Korea and Australia, to stay out of it. And obviously, Japan did stay away. But when the United Kingdom changed its course during this time, March 2015, many others joined the camp, and 57 countries became the founding members of AIIB. Again, United States and Japan stayed out of this institution. Now, the membership expanded. As I checked the last time, I think it's 87. Probably some of you know more recent numbers, but it's been expanding, and it's now, in terms of membership, larger than ADB, Asian Development Bank, which is a bank initiated by Japan in 1966. So thus far, the United States and Japan are not member, and I will emphasize that there. AIIB has progressed so far with their 4 kind of major criteria of their pushing forward to have a higher standard: lean, clean, green, and fast. So they are trying to distinguish from some of the existing multi-development banks. Follow part of it, but then distinguish part of it. So lean being some of the management lean being management directors not being stationed in Beijing, so they are all discussion online and virtually and so on. clean, obviously in terms of environment, in terms of corruption and so on, to be kind of something that they would address seriously. So 16 basic legal documents have been adopted as of 2016, green environmental concerns, and also one emphasis was the speed of which that this bank can evaluate and implement projects. They claim that most of the AIIB items can be evaluated and approved within a year, while ADB actually usually takes about 21 months, while Japan, quite few of the projects have taken up to 5 years for approval. So this was a kind of emphasis with which the AIIB is pushing forward. Having said that, though, altogether, there has been a very significant pushback now that we are in 2019 in terms of where the BRI is heading. So some of the well-known issue of so-called Deathtrap, which is the significant investment being approved to build certain things. Like the case that's been significantly usually often discussed is the one of the port whose name escapes me, starts with H. But in Sri Lanka, where they have given loans to, but since the Sri Lankan government could not pay back, now that port is leased to China for 99 years. So when it comes to the most recent Belt and Road Initiative, so that's the second forum that they have held, yes, expansion was clear that there are more participants. 37 heads of state participated, and this is a map of which countries whose head of the state has participated. Also, many of the representatives of other countries came too. Meanwhile, China had to kind of discuss the fact that they have to be much more higher standard in terms of monitoring and scrutiny, and discussed about the fact that Deathtrap is not the kind of ways in which China will be pursuing in this type of investment in infrastructure. Obviously, this time one of the highlight of, you can see it, I guess, highlight of the participant coming head of the state is Italy. So Europe is now looking at this as kind of a threat, or at least kind of a concern, where the French Prime Minister was quoted in saying that Europeans' naivete about this Belt and Road Initiative is over. It will scrutinize this much more closely. So let me just. So now turning to Japan. So this is a partnership, and I apologize for the misspelling at the beginning. A partnership for quality investment is what Japan has promoted. Obviously, this idea was already in place prior to 2015, but the shock that BRI and AIIB created as of spring of 2015 triggered Abe's prominent announcement of this partnership for quality investment. This was also endorsed at the G20 Summit at Ise-shima in Japan 2016. And many of the components exist, but it's basically emphasis on increase in investment in quality infrastructure. So by the announcement, Japan is targeted to have 25% increase in infrastructure investment in Asia. And overall amount would be considered or more or less about $110 billion. And there are many kind of qualities, and the initiatives include many of these characteristics. One, obviously, as I just noted, Japan's and as well as ABD are trying to accelerate the approval procedure. So for ADB, instead of taking 21 months, which is the average that I noted, but now it's going to limit taking only 15 months. Japan is trying to decrease the amount of assessment period and approval period at the same time through JICA, which is the aid agency in Japan. Also, Japan established the dollar-based denominated ODA loans. As you may know, those who are looking at foreign aid of Japan, Japanese ODA is usually taking form of yen loans at the concessional level, while much of it now they could come from in terms of foreign aid in terms of dollars. And also there are limited, this is not across the board, but limited exemption from the recipient government in kind of providing guarantee for Japanese funds. So this will make some of the conditions relatively easy for the recipient countries to provide, receive foreign aid and then project investment from Japan. And also creating the international standard, which I will get to in a minute. Overall, there are a lot of components that goes into this partner for quality investment. And without further ado, I will give you this, which you probably can't read. But if you get this slides from the East-West Center, you can see this. This is from Ministry of Finance. Japanese government has a very enthused people who make PowerPoints. And this has all the component that goes into quality infrastructure. This is not mine. I probably don't have the energy or information or time to do this, but it includes JICA, JBIC, which is the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, other institutions from Japan, ADB, and then so on and so forth. They emphasize various components that I just mentioned about some of these sustainability issues and so on and so forth. So what's important in the current context is what's coming up in the G20 Summit in Osaka, coming up, I guess it's already started today, or it's about to start. It's tomorrow in Japan, which probably is almost today here. So they are having a summit in Osaka in the next few days. One of the emphasis that Japanese government is putting, which was already agreed at the Fukuoka Finance Ministers G20 meeting 2 weeks ago, I remember, which is to call for the principle for quality infrastructure investment, by basically talking about various things which are concerning from the BRI kind of initiative, where things like debt sustainability, social environment sustainability, as well as openness and transparency about all these investment into infrastructure, as well as emphasis on the economic efficiency. And via efficiency, the Japanese government's perspective on it is to have a good so-called life cycle cost for infrastructure. So obviously, one of the competition that Japan is facing, and which obviously kind of clearly Japan has been not winning or losing against China, is that initial cost of infrastructure investment, a project, are much cheaper through China, where they be loaning it at kind of not cheaper rate, but without as stringent conditions and so on and so forth, and easy access to funding. Meanwhile, if they don't work well, they break down, or they don't actually progress into materializing into an actual project, even the initial cheap cost doesn't really translate into a long-term life cost of infrastructure investment. So Japan is emphasizing, yes, it might take a little longer, it might take a bit more cost in terms of project assessment and so on and so forth, but once the quality is in place in the long run, because many of the infrastructure investment takes 40 years to actually materialize and be kind of effectively used and so on, this will be much more efficient to have quality infrastructure. So we don't know if this will be adopted, but apparently the Chinese government, also the leadership, also is in support of having these kind of quality considerations in place, because since this kind of principle being pushed, even in the context of G20, China has been pretty on board with it. So this is where we are in terms of BRI and PQI, but just to give you a bit of a context of why it is so important. So there is an infrastructure investment gap very clearly present, and since you are in town with ADB representative office here, I think I saw one person on the list, maybe he or she is here or not. But anyway, one of the most well quoted number from the ADB is that since 2017 is that there is $26 trillion of investment needs for infrastructure in the next 15 years. I started calculating in 2016 to 2030, and there are the estimates that exist. But significantly, that's very significant. The World Bank's investment only come up to more or less about 10% of it, and even adding ADB, it's not going to be sufficient. And that really kind of underlies this really a big topic, big challenge, big importance of this investment in infrastructure, while China is willing to pitch in a significant amount of money, while the quality of it is kind of the question that Japan is casting. Just to put a few debates on the table before I move forward to talk about the second part of the talk, and I have a few more slides on the first part. One is that, obviously the vast amount of infrastructure investment need is only one side of the story. Apparently, many of those funders, like the JBIC or various other private institutions, as well as some think tanks which calculated this in Washington, says that it's not the money that's lacking, but it's the bankable project that's missing. So it's not, yes, even if you kind of pump in significant amount of investment funding, if it cannot be put in place where the governance and all these assessments and so on are in place, that's not going to work well. So that's the kind of question regarding the quality one side, but just kind of highlighting the kind of need, funding need is not really the whole entire picture. It's much more to find projects which are viable. That's the challenge in infrastructure investment. So that's one debate. And that related to this quality of the governance of infrastructure investment. So there's a lot of talk about China's BRI and its aggressive or massive initiative in funding these infrastructure investment to be a way of racing to the bottom. So all these conditions, environmental, social, assessment, and so on, will be degraded or digressed from that initiative. And many are worried about that. Obviously, back in the late 2000s, there were a lot of writings about Chinese foreign aid, which was becoming quite prominent by then, calling China a rogue aid donor. So some of that discussion is still visible in this overall governance of infrastructure investment. At the same time, so Japan's, I'll get there in a minute, but Japan's push is to put the quality up. So it could be a competition to the race to the top by putting this competition in place where Japan is emphasizing quality investment, quality infrastructure investment. This might change the dynamics from race to the bottom to race to the top. So that's another kind of debate going on. Finally, I want to add this to talk a little bit about the high-speed rail initiative, kind of investment initiative in Indonesia. That the recipient side of the picture has to be, recipient side of the story has to be in the picture, in the sense that there is a push factor from Japan and China, but there is a pull factor in recipient countries, especially those are democracies. Prominent cases are places like Indonesia, Malaysia, as well as the Philippines. Because the electoral cycle of democracies are relatively short, and they have to cater to the people who would vote for them and so on and so forth, that kind of infrastructure competition becomes a very good kind of tools for politicians in those countries to use. And so Japan comes wanting to have that infrastructure investment in Indonesia, and China comes to compete. So it seems like there's a free lunch out there where they can kind of feast very well of abundant push in giving infrastructure investment. Case in point was this high-speed rail in Indonesia. This was the one that was connecting Jakarta to Bandung. So this was actually, the idea started in 2010 under Yudhoyono presidency. While it was slow going, Japan was the only one assessing the prospect and possibilities and feasibilities of this. And by 2015, by 2013 though, kind of China started coming on board and provided much better conditions or much lenient condition to win the bid vis-a-vis the Indonesian government in this high-speed rail. So China actually won over Japan, even though Japan started earlier in 2015. It was a significant shock to the Japanese government because Japan capitalized on high-speed rail. Well, so does China these days. But that was the kind of competition clearly demonstrated in on-the-ground competition that was going on. But that was 5 years ago. 4 years ago almost. So now what's happened? Do you know? Anybody? So that Bandung Jakarta railway has about 100 yards established or something really minimal like that. They still cannot move out some of the kind of clear out some of the areas, partly because there's a Indonesian Air Force which captures part of the railroad track, and they refuse to move from that area. So many of the problems associated with it, the cost is already kind of projected to be overrunning quite significantly and so on and so forth. So it's not working well. Japan, on the other hand, kind of tried to compete and actually bid for another rail, which is kind of runs about the same area going to Surabaya from Jakarta. In 2017. Again, it's really recent, so I haven't really seen that it's starting anytime really soon. But altogether, this is the kind of way in which competition plays out on the ground in Indonesia. Obviously, for Jokowi, who actually just won the election, this was a really kind of a political way of maneuvering how much he can attract, how much fund he can attract, how much he can accomplish, and so on and so forth. Obviously, it hasn't really worked out well. So in some ways, even though this seems to me a great free lunch for recipient countries, it's not really in many ways. Sometimes having more scrutiny and assessment prior to kind of starting the project would be much more beneficial for recipient countries. So just to kind of wrap up the first section, because of the major economic shift which has taken between Japan and China, I don't know if you can see this well. This is the GDP of Japan and China within East Asia. So East Asia meaning Northeast and Southeast Asia. I didn't include India in this. Japan was obviously, this is 1989 and 2017. Japan was the major economic power in East Asia up until the 1990s, which captured almost 65% of regional GDP, where China was relatively small. Now, almost 20 years going forward, now China captures as much as Japan used to, where Japan is still kind of managing about 20% of GDP. But these two mega economies have captured a significant component and power within the region. Now that's shifting, and many argue that Japan is trying to compete vis-a-vis China in order to remain its relevance and leadership within the region, while China is pushing forward to get their strong kind of initiative on the board and be the leader of the region. Obviously, U.S. comes into the picture, where Japan collaborates very significantly with the U.S. Even under Trump, this Quad, the whole Indo-Pacific initiative of the four major countries, Japan, US, India, and Australia, has been one of the signature piece for Japan to push this forward. So in some ways, there is a zero-sum game component that's been quite prominently put on the table in this context. But as a scholar, I would like to go back a little bit further and look at the kind of broader context, or maybe historical context, of this infrastructure development in East Asia overall, and think a little bit about how more fundamentally the infrastructure investment means for this region, and how Japan played this card, the funder and the financier of infrastructure, and how their development ideology and strategy has been in the past probably coming back recently, and how China was influenced and influencing this infrastructure investment overall. So obviously, my argument is, yes, there is a geostrategic component, that's probably true, but there is also another layer that is the kind of policy diffusion and the way in which Japan and China interact in infrastructure investment realm, which kind of gives another side of the story of how the policies of infrastructure development really gets shaped in East Asia. So just a bit about the history of Japan's economic cooperation. Japan has been the foreign aid donor and major foreign aid donor for East Asia for many, many years. Now it's a 65, almost kind of entering into 65th year, because Japan started its foreign aid in 1955 as a part of war reparations to some countries, and be part of the Colombo Plan, which was initiated by Western nations to help the countries in Asia which are devastated by the war and decolonization and so on and so forth. But Japan became a significant aid donor in the 1970s, along obviously with its economic rise and so on. Japanese government actually deliberately increased foreign aid. There has been a few foreign aid doubling plan coming into place from the late 1970s into 1990s. By the early 1990s, Japan became the largest foreign aid donor. And Japan was the largest foreign aid donor throughout the 1990s, pretty much throughout, I think, until 2001 or so. Obviously, that was helped by the strong yen and so on and so forth, but still, it was quite significant achievement from the country that was affected by the war and things like that. But meantime, it is clear that Japan was an outlier in the way that foreign aid was, Japanese government provided foreign aid. Japan was constantly criticized as a member of OECD DAC, which is a kind of a group of foreign aid donors. OECD is the group of rich countries, and DAC is the group that provide foreign aid and economic cooperation. Japan was constantly criticized for its tied aid. Basically, Japan, the aid that Japan gives has to procure from the Japanese companies. Also criticized for its emphasis on physical infrastructure, i.e. investment in transportation, energy, and so on and so forth. Also, there has been a significant criticism in terms of the kind of the least care about the social and environmental impact, setting up big dams and so on and so forth without thinking about the consequences of that. Even in, as I said, even 1966, when Japan initiated and helped by the US to establish Asian Development Bank, ADB, that kind of pseudonym for ADB was Asian Dams and Bridges, because that was what the institution was supposed to be emphasizing. So, but Japan really had very strong belief that infrastructure investment is very important. And sometimes Japanese took this approach called Trinity development approach, where foreign aid as well as investment from private sector and trade all together kind of as a package create a significant economic catch-up for late industrializers like Japan, like Southeast countries in South Asia, and even China. There are some documentation, if you're interested, in JICA Research Institute, which is a research institute attached to JICA, which is again the foreign aid implementation agency, which looks at this history of Japanese foreign aid and its own its beliefs. When it comes to China, Japan was a major contributor to foreign aid to China. So Japan's normalization and relationship with China basically starts in 1978, but 1979 to 2000, Japan provided about 2.7 trillion yen of foreign aid. It's kind of hard to calculate because it kind of goes back quite a ways. If you straight convert it to dollars, it's about $25 billion. But if you look at the inflation and the cost of price changes, it will be much more than that. And this was all provided at the usually sometimes grant, but mostly in a low interest rate loans to 152 projects operated in China. And this was one thing that infrastructure was a center point of. 45.3% of this amount of aid was given in transportation sector and 20% in energy sector. So altogether, 65% of this massive 25 billion or even more foreign aid was given to China's infrastructure, focusing on transportation and energy. So there are also deliberate kind of transmission of ideas of this Trinity development approach to China. There was a technical cooperation, some grants aid given to China, which was to emit and kind of translate some of this knowledge of Japanese investment and in infrastructure, and also the kind of a growth strategy to China. Japan coordinated deliberately with China's five-year economic planning to provide aid so that China can actually initiate what they want to have Japan fund. So top priority projects by the Chinese authority were respected, and involvement of state-owned enterprises was encouraged by the Japanese foreign aid implementation, through foreign aid implementation. So altogether, that years from especially late 1960s, basically 1980 through mid 1990s was a time that there was a policy, deliberate policy diffusion from Japan to China, where China was basically emulating or learning from Japanese aid practices in emphasizing infrastructure and combining foreign aid with the investment as well as trade to create this rapid growth strategy within China. Obviously, as you probably heard, Japanese foreign aid in China has been phased out. In 2008, Japan phased out its foreign aid loans, which is a majority of what China was receiving, claiming that China, having already hosting Olympics, was already advanced enough not really need that kind of foreign aid. And it was the entire foreign aid was terminated last year in 2018, at the time when Abe met with Xi Jinping at their summit. Basically, China is already advanced enough that aid is not needed. So the history has concluded, but the whole transmission of the ideas of development has been transmitted through that kind of process. Meanwhile, I just mentioned that, obviously, Japan is still a major foreign investor to infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia. And when China started this venture of kind of going out strategy, I guess that's the campaign that started late 1990s, maybe, again, 21st century basically. That's the kind of same, kind of came from the same playbook that Japan used to do again in the 70s, 80s, to some extent to the early 1990s. So this is the commercial orientation, the Trinity development approach, all together kind of packaged in one. And that's kind of really a significant departure from the Chinese traditional foreign aid, which actually started in the 1950s already, to developing countries kind of having very strong ideological driven kind of anti-market kind of strategy, while now it's a very commercially oriented strategy, which was, again, very similar to what Japan used to do back in the 1980s and 90s. The question there, interestingly, is that why Japan stopped doing that? Obviously, one, Japan is an OECD DAC member, and that is a kind of a peer pressure group. To be part of that, there are a lot of standards and procedures that Japan had to follow. And because Japan was a kind of a threat or rogue aid back in the 70s and 80s, there were some rules set against the kind of practice. So tied aid was phased out and become a very kind of a criticized element by early 1990s. There's a Helsinki Accord that was agreed, and that put tied aid very impossible to implement. And there are a lot of pressure against Japan about the high standard of social and environmental standard, kind of phasing out from the physical infrastructure into more of the social infrastructure, so on and so forth. At the same time, obviously, Japanese project has gotten very expensive because of its high quality and very risk averse. Many of the Japanese private institutions, the kind of general contractors and so on and so forth, became much less willing to take quite kind of high risk that often get associated with the infrastructure investment, and also because Japanese government could not support the kind of covering the risk as much as it used to, given the decreases of aid, especially in the 21st century, as well as the kind of changing conditions. Altogether, that created Japan from receding in the late 1990s into the 2000s from the scene of infrastructure investment. Obviously, now that China is coming into this game, Japan got re-engaging, motivated to come in. So the last part of the story is that now, with the uncertainty coming from the rise of Trump, the U.S.-China trade tensions, and so on and so forth, as you saw in October Summit last year between Prime Minister Abe and then Xi Jinping, is that now they are talking more about collaborating, not with each other directly, but in the third countries. So case in point is now Thailand is going to develop some of the transportation project. Now Japan and China are going to work together to provide that infrastructure. So again, this is really very recent, so we don't know where it's going to head. But now it seems to me that emulation that kind of transmits some of the policy ideas from Japan to China back when is now through competition creating the convergence of the practice between Japan and China. Obviously Japan wants to push for its own standard to be more prominent, while China kind of pushes back in order to gain some of the advantage there where the competition still stands. So just to summarize, again, I argued in the kind of the beginning that there's a lot of this investment competition going on, and seen more through the geostrategic lens. But there are a lot of kind of additional elements that one should take into consideration, where through economic history or story of regional economic development, where Japan led that development through its own practice, which was obviously kind of derived from its own development experience of the Meiji forward, to provide investment for infrastructure, combined with the private sector investment to develop that infrastructure with trade kind of dynamics, all packaged in one for catch-up growth strategy for the region. So here in that context, China wasn't the exception as the partner in the region, where Japan had engaged quite closely with them. Japan really wanted the Chinese economy to be integrated into the global, as well as obviously regional economy back in the 1980s into 1990s. So there was some emulation on the part of China from that relationship, especially through foreign aid. While now, with the rise of China, this competition also kind of catered to converging some of the practices that's going on in infrastructure investment, even though they say they are different. If you look closely, the emphasis on infrastructure is the same. It's just the way that they emphasize the standard and so on. While we will see where this race to the bottom or race to the top will play out when it comes to the infrastructure investment rules, and that's where the competition exists. Not necessarily the amount, not necessarily kind of country based. Maybe there are a few cases where it get highlighted in the media, and I see that to be a geostrategic competition too. But what's most important when it comes to the governance of foreign aid and infrastructure investment overall is this rule-making competition that's now playing out as we speak at G20 Osaka, and this will continue to really shape the infrastructure investment regime in East Asia and maybe beyond from now forward. So I will stop here, and if you have comments and questions, I'll be happy to kind of engage in dialogue.
Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful presentation. If I could pick up just on one of your latter points, I read in your paper that there was an extent to which Japan used Chinese subcontractors in their investments in China and in partnerships to help them develop their programs there. To what extent have these subcontractors played a role in helping China make their own projects as they're competing with Japan?
Yeah. So that depending on the time frame, but many of them, when it started out, they didn't have any expertise, both technical and the managerial, and they learned a lot from engaging with the Japanese foreign aid, and that obviously becomes the kind of foundation of many of the strategies that that's engaging, that China's engaging now. So I think there are a lot of these on the ground, kind of corporate, company-based transmission also going on. We haven't, we have a general idea. We haven't really looked into case by case, but I think it'd be interesting to look into the cases. But my sense is definitely a lot to do with China's strategy currently.
Oh, thank you. I'll ask just one more before I turn it over to the audience. To what extent has China been responding to Japan's claim that they had better quality investment that lasts longer? How are they answering that?
I think so. To some extent, they not vis-a-vis Japan and China, in the sense. I think they do agree with that. I don't think there's any kind of major pushback saying that Japan's quality, the kind of claim to quality is bogus. I think it's true. At the same time, there is so China thinks that it's it's the leader of developing world, while Japan is now kind of in the group of developed countries. So being part of the G7 and all that, Japan is in a kind of a different group. So for China, kind of just pursuing quality, a stringent assessment, and all those is some ways to take the ladder away from other developing countries from catching up. So yes, true that quality might be higher for Japan, but if the developing countries cannot even start to have transportation or great ports or some other infrastructure like the digital infrastructure that creates divide between the rich and the poor, that makes them totally out of the game of getting wealthier and catch up growth. So in some ways, I think their claim much more is that yes, true, the quality, the level of Japan's quality is great, but it's more important for developing countries to have some access to infrastructure, even if it's not as good as as squeaky clean and wonderful and long lasting as the one that's pursued by Japan. So that's the kind of way in which they see it, as it would be their advantage to capitalize on that.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Now, if you wouldn't mind giving your name and affiliation before asking a question, both for us and for our online viewers, thank you very much. I turn it over to the audience. Who would like to ask the first question? Please, sir.
Thank you. Julia Williams at King's College London. Thank you very much for your comprehensive talk. I'd like to know how much of Japan's ODA and aid is tied again nowadays. If I understand, there is a lot of procurement that goes to Japanese subcontractors. Some authors like Hidetaka Yoshimatsu argue that there is a dual component of also boosting the Japanese economy through exports, through this partnership with private infrastructure. And this ties back to the, if you want, a paradoxical point. That is that by raising the standards, the high quality infrastructure standards, there is potentially also a national interest component that benefits your own companies, precisely because the costs have risen and precisely because you're interested, perhaps Japan would be interested or the US would be interested in exporting their own expensive infrastructures. And so by raising the standards, there is also this sort of like big, where it's not automatically a race to the top, but it can be actually, in a sense, it's a Chinese practice or whatever you want to call it, an old Japanese practice. And what do you think about this point? Because I see that there is this link. I think there is this linkage.
Yeah,
which is not spoken of.
I take your point fully. I think very interesting and great that Hidetaka Yoshimatsu is the one that's been writing a lot about this from Japan, and he's very good. So if you researching on this, you should look at his paper. But yes, I take your point that yes, standard setting is a competition which has the backing of the private sector gaining advantage by having that standard in place in competition globally, regionally, and so on. And Japan is playing that game. Obviously, Japan wants its private sector to gain from that. having said that, though, the private sector is not following or pressuring Japanese government as much as one would think.
Yeah.
Obviously, they welcome that, and they like JBIC's money to invest in Thailand and Thailand's high-speed rail and so on and so forth. But in some ways, for them, maybe it's not enough, or they are still so risk-averse that they can't actually step in. Which I think is a very ironic thing, because that's the kind of private sector stepping in and actually really helping the Japanese government gain upper hand in this was what the Japanese government actually wants. So there's kind of I actually am working on a book which talks about this quite a bit. There is this kind of a bit of a disconnect between what government wants, and it still has this, I call it developmentalist DNA, where government wants to lead the private sector to gain upper hands in competition, while private sector kind of going somewhere else. Or maybe government's lead is not enough for private sector to feel comfortable stepping in because of its business calculations, risk averseness, the way in which infrastructure is now developed. It's kind of a all package deal. It's not the one, like just looking at the rail and the trains kind of stuff. It has to look at the ticketing to the urban planning and so on and so forth. And my understanding is Japanese private sector has not been as good at kind of getting all that all in one package as China is. And again, risk calculation. China's now government is all backing it. I don't know how long it can last, but at this point, the SOEs or whatever the companies would go in can take pretty much as much risk as they need, while that's not the case with Japan. So yes, strategically, what you're saying is very correct. And the Japanese government call it all Japan strategy, that it's not the tied-in, but it's a PPP more, like a public-private partnership to engage in this infrastructure investment or project and export and so on, which Prime Minister Abe wants to use as one of the growth strategy for the Japanese economy too. While so far, things might change, but so far the result of private sector engaging aggressively in that, especially in comparison to what China is doing, is still quite limited. That's my understanding.
Hi, I'm Kathleen, Mystery Advisors. I worked with JETRO in the 1990s in both Manhattan and Tokyo. And what is JETRO's role in this today? And I have a follow-up question, but I'll ask it later.
Yeah, well, so JETRO, I don't know if I see JETRO in this.
I love it.
Well, no, it doesn't appear. But JETRO is one of those domestic institutions that kind of helps. I really haven't seen any initiative JETRO, but maybe I'm missing something.
But they're not taking a lead. They're not in a strong.
Not really. At this point, I think JETRO's emphasis. Obviously, some of the JETRO officials and the previous officials and so on are engaged in this, but it's much more. I really haven't seen in that infrastructure one. Again, I might be missing.
No, I'm sure you're right on target. My second question had to do with the going out of Japan for different projects. What is your percentage of work in the Gulf, and also how do you see yourself being more engaged in India?
So the Japanese government.
Well, I mean, for infrastructure projects, we all know India needs more better infrastructure. So
India is the great customer for Japan these days, right? So foreign aid-wise too, I think Vietnam and India are the two major recipients of foreign aid as well as a lot of infrastructure investment. India, I think, when was it, 2 years ago? Japan just won the bid for high-speed rail. I think it was $85 billion or something crazy expensive or crazy high cost like that. But still, that was kind of a strategic engagement too. So in terms of India, it's a Quad, the member of the Quad free and open Indo-Pacific group, Indo-Pacific group. So altogether, India's role is very large. In terms of Gulf, so Japan's emphasis is much more on Asia, and the Gulf is not part of that.
Okay.
While there are some infrastructure investment given to Gulf too. When it comes to AIIB actually emphasized quite a bit of those areas. Like Oman is one of the major recipients of AIIB infrastructure investment. So Japan is looking at that and then following some of it, but at the same time, strategically or diplomatically or politically speaking, Asia large, so Central Asia and India kind of included, becomes the target of Japanese strategy.
Do you envision them going in alone with just Indian partners, or do you envision the Japanese companies going in partnership with the Chinese companies to India?
Good question. India is very wary of China's investment overall. At this point, India is probably the country that Japan would go alone most likely, or with US or Australia or other these more quad type of FOIP, free open Indo-Pacific partner type of members. While it's the Southeast Asia, which are many of these countries partly enjoy that competition because they get a lot of good deals out of that competition, but also wary of it. That's the place where they are the ones talking about collaboration. I think, if I understood correctly, they actually listed 3,000 or so possible collaborations, mostly around Southeast Asia, between Japan and China at the time of that summit. And I don't know how many of them are just like how do you call it, the thing that's really totally just the imagination, while others are probably quite close to reality.
I must say that the Chinese have really kicked the Indians into, oh wow, I better pay attention to solar panels, because 15 years ago I tried to bring solar panels into the state of Telangana, and I was told, Mrs. Mystery, we've got that paint, it's enough, and so in 2 factories in Telangana, which is probably now under the -2 since they split. The Chinese were very strategic. They sent 2 boys out to get all the university work, like in Australia and whatever, set up the factories there, do the practice, put them back in, and then have them start factories in India. So they went in as young, seasoned experts. And the Indians finally woke up saying, oh, I can do something. There really is a market there. So it's been very interesting. I even see the Japanese do that at that time.
Yeah, so I think collaboration with India is a big prospect for Japan.
It should be.
Prime Minister Abe is a big fan of India, as you probably know, and India is a good strategic partner. Having said that, I actually wrote a book on BRICS.
Okay.
So China collaborate with India part of the time. Obviously, it seemed much more as competitors with each other, while there are a few kind of fundamental issues that they agree, like the governance of IMF or stuff like that. So there are some elements of India looking at China as a possible way to leverage changes in the global governance. While yes, I think there is a competition that is making India act more strategically and kind of put their energy in
my observation, and I spend part of my year in India, so as a homeowner, I'm very dedicated to the fact that everybody gets a fair deal. And I really think that India could benefit from the high standards that the Japanese companies have for keeping their quality up. And I think that would benefit the Indian community in the long run, to have really good things good.
Yeah, I think overall, Japan's foreign aid has been highly appreciated around the world, and especially in Asia, again, including South Asia, where it's not only high quality items and infrastructure and all that, but also they have worked very closely on the ground with the local communities and the government to really get some of the rules in place, maybe try to counter some of the corruption that is, kind of endangering some of the project. I don't know how successfully, but
no, there is less.
there are, and one element that I noticed, which I think is quite interesting, is that Japan has this initiative of legal capacity building. So they are now working with the judiciary and sending some of the experts on the legal front to make sure that these projects have good legal grounds, like eminent domain. All these are very important kind of legal questions that many of these recipient countries have very limited amount of experience as well as expertise. So these are the kind of things that Japan has very quietly. It's not like billions of dollars, right? This is probably like $1 million project. But these are the ones that's ground up building in order to have some better governance structure within those countries. And I don't know how, I really haven't focused on India to say how much of that is done in India. And India has a lot of quite significant legal infrastructure, I'm sure. So maybe
It's
not
long. Very
not
long.
that case. But still, I think that kind of approach has been Japan's kind of tendency, especially like 1990s moving, kind of going forward. So kind of interesting compliments to the big infra, mega billion thing versus the very small but still probably quite important corporation that's going on.
Please, Bella.
So, Bella Chan, Digital Fellow at East Center.
Oh,
So,
hey.
I am in the same program you were in a few days ago.
Nice to see you.
So, my understanding when Japan proposed the quality infrastructure initiative is to differentiate it from, well-perceived, China's low quality projects.
Right.
So, you mentioned a phenomenon that, now Japan and China is working together in some Southeast Asian countries. So I wonder, how does it work? What will happen to the quality infrastructure?
Well, I think Japan will still, in terms of governance, Japan will keep insisting on that high quality. While I think when I understand Thailand, there's a kind of division of labor. So it's not they're doing all together as a mix, but there are different stretch of the transportation. I think it's the railroad going north and south west and east. They are trying to kind of sort out who's doing what and make sure that some of the kind of interoperability among the infrastructure would be in place. So these are the ways in which they work together. So they're not going to mix everything and kind of work it out, but it's the kind of trying to emphasize where they are strongest at and kind of collaborate with each other. Again, I think it's still kind of planning stage, so I really don't know the details of it, but the prospect is to collaborate in such a way that there be some strength being emphasized on each project and kind of coordinate with each other.
Thank you.
So, thanks for the talk. I'm a Chinese correspondent. I just have a simple question. Back to the first question, you talked about the link between the government and private companies because of different consideration. Could you give me some kind of simple, specific example, like which project or in which country the government really wants to do something, but the private companies does not respond?
Well, yeah, so that's a good question. I can't say from the current environment, I haven't really looked into that first of all, but in the past, in the early 2000s, I believe, the JICA started this kind of a facility called STEP, which is, I can't remember what it stood for, but this is a collaboration with the private sector and the Japanese government, the JICA, to get some of the infrastructure investment going in Southeast Asia. If you want, I can probably send concrete information. I haven't looked at this for this talk, so I can't remember the details of it too much. But So they had some millions of dollars set aside that they could provide and so on, and they were looking for a lot of applicants from the private sector because this is a government money to implement some of the infrastructure project, and only 3 applied or something kind of really low like that. That was capitalized as one of the ways in which Japanese private sector is not following. Also, I actually interviewed some officials, and this is the confidential interview, so I'm not going to tell who they were, but they were telling me that they have always difficult time convincing the private sector to come along with the scheme that they have because of the kind of high risk and long-term commitment and things like that. But I might be able, if you can email me, I can probably send you some of the concrete examples from now. I'm curious myself too. I haven't really looked into this, but there's a kind of general sense that that this really has been government initiative, while private sector is not necessarily pushing it. By the way, one thing I can give you more concretely is this. I just remembered. So when AIIB was proposed, right, by the Chinese, and the Japanese government was reluctant. And everybody around Japan, not in Japan, well, even in Japan maybe, were wondering why Japanese government is reluctant, besides the fact that it's Chinese initiative. So yes, strategically maybe Japan is reluctant. But China keeps saying, oh, this will be open bid, and you'll be able to, the Japanese private sector can bid on these projects. So everybody wondering, why the Japanese business is not pushing the government, right? In this context, the Minister of Finance was providing, this is the other way around, but still it kind of shows the same dynamics. The other way around, saying that don't worry about losing the bid to the AIIB, because even in ADB, which Japan is a dominant player, right? So Japan and US have the same voting rights, the chair, 60% each basically. Even in ADB, Japanese companies only wins 0.5% of the infrastructure bids. 0.5%. Most of it is won by the Chinese companies, Indian companies, and so on and so forth, mostly because of the cost. So that's what, because Minister of Finance was not very happy about AIIB, they didn't want any competition coming to ADB's prominence in Asia and so on and so forth. Again, things might change from the 2015, but anyway, that's when they started saying, well, but look at ADB, we are dominating, but you only get 0.5% because it's just the way that bid is done and so on. Japanese companies are not getting enough share. So it's their reluctance on one side and their inability to actually win any bids of the level vis-a-vis the Chinese competitors. These are the private, or either at least private or semi-private, commercial-based bidding. The Chinese competitors or the Indian competitors make them less willing to push for any of that level of that kind of project. So again, for AIIB, it was to dissuade them from kind of saying that this is good for the Japanese private sector. At the same time, kind of similar logic apply to probably kind of similar parallel applies to probably kind of show how private sector engaging is not as prominent as that. One thing I was going to say. No, well, but if I might look into more of that stuff later.
Jose Colazo with Asia Minute. I was wondering if you could comment on the Chinese population's opinions about the ADB in light of all the renegotiations that it's doing with its clients. I mean, is there any domestic pressure or saying, is this going to work for us? Or the Chinese people's view of the BRI, sorry, the BRI.
Altogether?
Yes.
I'm not the best person to ask that question. I really
curious.
don't kind of look closely into Chinese public opinion or BRI. But yes, so again, as I said, the second forum that just happened April this year is to kind of counter that type of negative narrative of BRI, Deathtrap, and some kind of China's power play and this and that. My sense, again, I be clear that I'm not a China expert, so the domestic politics of China is something that I'm not, I just know from, a few newspapers kind of stuff. But my sense is that China can continue to engage this type of investment abroad for a while, but there is a mounting kind of view of, well, why not invest in China? There are some, quite a bit of need in social infrastructure and so on and so forth, and there is some level of that emerging. I cannot say whether how much of it and how strong or how concerning that is against BRI, but I think there is still already that type of criticism kind of bubbling up in China. Another thing that I always wonder, which I don't know if anybody is expert, I would like to know, is how this can be how long this BRI type of venture can be sustained. As I said, one of the reasons why many of the quote private, but state-owned enterprises and so on can engage in these ventures is that because they don't have to worry too much about the losses, right? But I think if you look at many of the projects, there are a lot of loss-making projects already out there. And yes, true that China has a lot of funds, and there are ways that funds can be created, not in the same way that Japan can or can't. But I don't know how this is sustainable. I would like, if there's a China special, that's why we are kind of looking for, if there's any China special, we can kind of join me to talk about Chinese side, but this is not the very best time of the year for capturing scholars, because a lot of them are in China working on their research, so I couldn't find people to do so, but I would like to know that that's my curiosity.
They're watching online.
Yeah. Okay, maybe they can email me and give me some advice.
Please email.
On that.
Please.
Hi, I'm Mark Whiskey. I'm an intern here at East West Center, and we've been talking a lot about physical infrastructure like trains, highways, dams, and whatnot. And I was wondering if digital infrastructure is on the radar at all, and if so, how is that kind of differentiated between China and Japan? Is it the same kind of differentiation, or is it different?
That's a very good question, which I don't really have much answer to. I'm kind of when it comes to a concrete digital part of it, it hasn't been highlighted as much, and I have, so it's probably the telecommunication is part of the digital structure, and I know I did mention that digital divide is one of the features, but I really haven't closely looked at each project as to which one really catered to that digital. But I think in the future, going forward, it's pretty crucial now with the 5G and all those things going on. I think this will really be an important future item that most countries are looking at. But I really don't know much about concrete elements of that aspect. So, if you know anything, let me know.
Anil Sigdel from Nepal Matters. You talk about BRICS, you said you have a book on BRICS.
Mm-hmm.
So was there negotiation about infrastructure investment between India, China, or any sort of collaboration with this new initiative China would have? Is there anything that we should know that happened in the BRICS about this huge infrastructure investment?
So BRICS, the way that we look at BRICS is that BRICS as the summitary, right? So BRICS summit started in 2009 in the aftermath of global financial crisis. And they started meeting at the G20 because all the BRICS members are G20 representatives. And they kept, they have kept meeting for every year now for the 10th year, now going into 11th year. One element that I discussed here is that in 2013, going to 2015, they established a development bank. It's a multilateral development bank called New Development Bank. It used to be called the BRICS Development Bank, which I prefer, but anyway, so it's a new development bank in Shanghai. which is at this point it's the half of the size of AIIB. And at this point, they only provide funding to the members, so 5 countries. And they have started operating already, last few years. But it's kind of, it became very low profile because AIIB was such a high profile entity. It didn't get talked about as much, but it still exists and it still starts to provide. So beyond these 5 countries, they haven't extended infrastructure investment yet. But the same principle apply in terms of the emphasis. It's infrastructure is an emphasis, and also so that's what BRICS is. From Chinese perspective, BRICS Bank is more for the global reach. So AIIB, even though now it has 87 countries, so it kind of reaches around the world, but still the emphasis is on Asia. Well, BRICS for China is to have representation in Africa, in Western Hemisphere, Russia and India combined. So many ways, that's one emphasis that China has. Also, talking about BRICS itself, not necessarily the bank per se, but the BRICS is a very important entity for China because it's not China being aggressively pushing for global governance change, right? It's a kind of like-minded emerging market economies thinking that the kind of agreeing on the shortcomings of global governance dominated by the G7, again, US, UK, Canada, Europe, and so on and so forth. And for China, it allows China to voice their views of the shortcomings of global governance without looking like it's threatening the entire system. It gives them much more legitimacy about their claims, which part of that is true. It's being monopolized by the major economies. Their representation is very the emerging markets representation is still very limited. So that's how they are. So again, so these are the ways in which BRICS has been useful for China.
So it's not like AIIB in a way which is related to the BRI.
No.
So they don't want to.
Not necessarily.
Do the
Well,
same
so
thing with BRICS.
some say AIIB itself is not totally related. So for China, BRI is their bilateral approach to engaging, while AIIB is their multilateral approach. So they are using this somewhat separately, even though yes, there is an overlap. But yeah, BRICS Bank is not. It's a BRICS operation rather than the BRI related operation.
Okay, so the AIIB funding is not accounted as the BRI's part, right?
No.
When they fund any project for BRI through AIIB, how should we
Yeah, well, I think that comes from the fact that BRI is such a nebulous concept. So yes, maybe if if AIIB funds something in, some project in, probably not. Well, say Pakistan. Then yes, is it part of BRI or not? I think it's hard to say. But just for the credit of AIIB, they have to go through the process pretty stringently. Even though they go fast and so on and so forth. So just kind of doing it because China wants to do it would not be the case for AIIB. There might be some overlap of interest that some project might be considered for both both BRI and funded by AIIB. But in most cases, their vetting process is pretty sophisticated, and many of these projects, I can't remember the percentage, but majority of the project is co-funded, co-financed with other multilateral development, MDBs, multilateral development banks, like ADB or World Bank or European Development Bank, and so on and so forth. So it's really it's quite hard to use AIIB as an instrument solely for the purpose of BRI.
Hi, I'm Rachel Vandenberg from the U.S. Institute of Peace. I wanted to follow up first on the question that was asked earlier about Southeast Asia and collaboration between China and Japan in Southeast Asia and Thailand in particular. Are there other examples of other countries where China and Japan are also collaborating and on infrastructure projects? And then is perhaps it's early in the research, or perhaps it's too early to tell, but is there any indication that this collaboration with Japan's emphasis on the quality infrastructure and good standards and good life cycle cost, does that put pressure on China to push up the quality or life cycle cost on its end? And then also, I guess I'm wondering if the idea is that Japan provides the quality part of the project and the lower risk investment, and then China is involved in the higher risk part and perhaps with less emphasis on quality standards, then where's the benefit for China in that?
Mm-hmm. Well, all great questions, but I think all is just to be seen. I think, again, even the collaboration that we are talking about is still very initial stage. And so far, discussions have taken place about other collaborations, but as far as I know, there's no concrete project that's taking place that really has Japan and China really collaborating and implementing anything. So again, I'll look again. So far, this is really a very early stage. So a confirmation of that collaboration was just a half year ago. So many of these things are kind of coming to works, and others are all good questions that I'm kind of casting as the future ways to think. How does it work? And yes, is it good for China? At the same time, so I think it's kind of connected to what I said earlier that how long can China maintain this strategy of probably kind of throwing money out there everywhere without worrying about the risk and worrying about those. China's leadership also wants a certain level of quality, accountability, control, and so on. So I think there is a kind of, I guess if you can use the word synergy or positive kind of dynamics hopefully taking place because of actual need, actual kind of concerns on the part of the government. But just kind of respond. It's too early to tell. It's too early to see. But these are fundamental questions in the next 10, 15 years. And I think if you're doing your dissertation research, or I don't know if you have already done it, but kind of working on that would be very interesting.
But on the sustainability of the BRI, that question, I was also talking with Derek Caesar here at the AEI, who tracks the China investment. Very recently, he told me like the BRI is already, right now it's sort of a rhetoric because the money has already gone down.
Yes.
Chinese money, because of the economy and everything, they don't have money. So it's the investment they're doing through BRI is already down. It's only they're talking about it, but they're not investing it. Yeah,
so $1 trillion is much more this kind of ad balloon that kind of being floated in the air saying this is the kind of goal. Well, yes, I was looking at that too. Like, since 2016 was the highest, I think, or maybe 2015 was the highest. It has gone down as the actual implementation of the loan itself. Again, we don't know if that's going to be the case. And with this trade war going on, I think there's a higher priority or higher concern. I don't know where this is going to go. But yes, so again, maybe that future of China needing to really kind of move to another stage of its economic outreach might be already arriving. Again, we don't know, and also Japan's stance between U.S. and China really has a lot of bearing on this, right? So so far, the Prime Minister Abe is playing pretty smart way of hedging against each other, but I don't know how long that can be he can maintain that, and we will see. But I think we are looking at a very dynamic period of this dynamic among Japan, China, and US, and that has a major implications on the future development course of the region overall, not only Southeast Asia, but Central Asia and beyond. Even Europeans are now looking at it, kind of worrying about it, and kind of putting a new look, giving a new look at it. So, interesting topic to look into, yeah?
Just as an aside, hopefully it's not, where do you see Korea coming into this, since we haven't seen it?
Yes, so Moon, the President Moon didn't go to the BRF, the second summit, and I don't know what that indicates. Korea. So Korea has two sides. Korea has two sides to it. I guess they're not looking for significant infrastructure investment the way that Southeast Asia or Central Asia are, because Korea is a more advanced nation. While it is a foreign aid donor, it is actually an OECD DAC member, and it actually wants to be working to be a middle power. I think its foreign aid is more or less about 1/10 of what Japan's been giving. So it's not insignificant, but it's still small. Their role in this whole big powers play has been at this point relatively limited. That's my understanding. While at this point their priority is probably not necessarily kind of bandwagoning one or the other, but I think if they are to G7, G20 wise, I think my sense is they are welcoming that whole principle of high standard, because I think they are the ones who can play that same game as Japanese can. While China's kind of way that BRI is done is not what South Korea can keep up. So, but so far I really haven't seen anything major. But my sense is that G20 will be a good thing for them.
Wow. The very question I would have asked. Thank you. Please.
Yeah, just to follow up, Phyllis Yoshida from Sasakawa.
Yes.
You talked a little bit about hopefully maybe Japan and China getting together on some of the infrastructure projects, and you mentioned the announcement that the U.S., Australia, et cetera, the Quad, will be working together, or announced that they would work together on infrastructure projects. I know when I worked for the U.S. government, we often coordinated, but it was very hard to collaborate on infrastructure in particular. I heard there's one project maybe that started in Papua New Guinea regarding LNG infrastructure, perhaps, but I haven't heard much of anything else other than the words.
Yeah. So I think it's a good point about coordination and collaboration. I think coordination takes place relatively easily. Yeah, I think that might be the extent of what Japan and then China can do. But there are a lot of studies now starting, but I don't think it's kind of concrete yet. And when it comes to collaboration, that's probably very difficult to do. I take it.
The collaboration among the U.S., like other than on project like training projects and things, are probably difficult when you're dealing with maybe two lead companies from different countries and how you work with other suppliers, et cetera.
I think we have time for
interesting to see what actually happens.
Yeah, so I'll be following up and see what it comes out concretely, because I think it's studying it is one thing, but implementing it is totally another.
We have time for one last question.
Will these infrastructure projects be dealing with anything with water?
I think wasn't there? Yeah, so 3% of the infrastructure need, but I think water is actually a very crucial what do you call it? Infrastructure that for Southeast Asia and in various parts around the world.
We are almost out of water in Tamil Nadu right now. It's extremely sad situation.
Yeah, and it's related to the dam construction and all that too. So I think there's a lot of that.
Thank you.
So with that, before I conclude, I would be remiss in my responsibilities if I didn't talk about a few upcoming programs at the ISWA Center in Washington. With our current Asia Studies visiting fellows, we have a seminar tomorrow with Mr. Riaz Coker. It'll be on U.S.-Pakistan relations, challenges and prospects to pivot from AFPAC to Indo-Pacific from 12 o'clock to 1:30. And we will have another seminar with Bella Tran on Friday from 12 to 1:30 on locating the US-Vietnam Comprehensive Partnership in the Indo-Pacific Strategy. And for all future programs, please visit our website, please follow our social media. Thank you all for coming, and thank you especially to Professor Katada.